Well, firstly, I want to thank you for inviting me to give a talk like this. It's not often you're asked to sort of look back and see how the world developed, of which you were a small part. So what I'd like to do is to start sort of at the beginning. I joined the faculty of Sydney University in 1966, and I was very lucky that the university had already had a computer for 11 years, the Celiac, and there was the professor working on the computer. In those days, that meant using a screwdriver and moving things around. When I arrived, they had already moved computers into sort of sacrosanct halls, and you communicated through a hole in the wall with these punch cards. And you had to learn what the punch holes meant. So the first thing was that when I told the professors there that I wanted to study design, the professor of engineering said, "Design is a mystery that fundamentally cannot be understood." And that didn't come across as very nice way to respond. And then the professor of architecture said, if you do get to understand design, you will destroy it. Neither of these were very encouraging, but we persisted. So what was happening then? Christopher Alexander had just completed his PhD at Harvard in 1964 and turned it into a book called The Synthesis of Form, which showed that you could use mathematical models to synthesize things. A few years later, Herb Simon gave a talk at MIT that resulted in the sciences of the artificial, the notion of studying things not only in the natural world. And then, of course, Simon and Newell wrote this rather significant book on general problem solving from using AI. So what we looked at was not building computer models of mathematical models or physics models, but where could you do things where there weren't mathematical models? And we looked at things like city planning codes that turned out you could re-represent quite nicely symbolically. And we produced the thing SAP, which isn't the one that is the major international corporation, but the Site Analysis Package, which IBM funded in the 60s. And then we started to build economic models about city planning and turned those into a company that sold services of that kind. And then suddenly in the 60s, people came across graphics. And the part of graphics that we were interested in was not how to represent what was there, but could you generate results? And in particular, what we became increasingly interested in was, were there emergent properties, that is, shapes that you did not put there? And this became a whole field of research in itself. And in Australia, there was a surprising level of acceptance or interest in the use of computers, in this case in architecture. So we started to run courses in the late 60s, which were quite well attended. This notion of simulation led directly to optimization. And we increasingly did research and got funding and PhD students to work in optimization. And I like to write, so we always wrote books and papers. And we did intriguing and interesting things like, is it possible to improve on a Pareto optimal design? Well, in principle, no, but it turns out in practice you can. I mean, Pareto optimal is a special class of design which if you don't know is fine, and if you do know is fine too. So it turned out we were able to use computational models of ideas to explore beyond what was normally looked at. And at the same time, amazingly enough, industry was interested, and we got involved in some of the biggest projects in the country. And that was always lots of fun. In the 70s, AI became very interesting. And we took a lot of the ideas from AI and turned it into an area called knowledge-based design, which was built on fairly standard AI ideas, representation, reasoning, did a lot of work with expert systems, planning systems. But one of the problems with AI is that it's really good at telling you about the world. But design is not about the world. Design is about future worlds, worlds that don't exist. And a lot of the foundations of AI, like monotonicity and things like that, turned out to be limiting, and you needed to think a little more. Learning became popular in the 70s and 80s, and from that we were able to build systems that learned design rules and then learned patterns of design rules from which you could build grammars, not of rules, but grammars of patterns of rules. And then neural networks, which in the sort of mid-80s was starting to have a major resurgence. So what we built were things like this. This was an expert system that took the building code and assessed whether a building satisfied the code. And it went through and explained where it failed to satisfy the code. So this was a system in the 80s. This is about 85. And then we took ideas from planning and from design patterns and built knowledge-based design systems where you could put in requirements and it would generate solutions. And of course, we wrote a textbook, knowledge-based design systems, and started up a conference series. Anyone involved in design often will get involved in creativity. So in the 80s, we started a conference series, which if you've been there, you will know very well, because the conference series was held on a small tropical island in Australia's Great Barrier Reef during the turtle egg laying season, which I'm sure was not the attraction of the conference. The topic was the attraction, but the location wasn't bad. And here's an example of the sort of things that we were interested in. This is an idea I had that based on genetic engineering. Genetic engineering is the human intervention in natural evolution, where you modify some aspect of the genome. And it starts this way. There's something about the organism which is connected not to an individual gene, but to the structure of the genome, and some aspect of the behavior of that organism is uniquely connected to that. So you could take that idea and produce a bunch of designs, segment them into good and bad designs. And in this case, unlike medicine, which is interested in bad outcomes and see if you can reduce them, we're interested in good outcomes and can you increase them. And so what we did is we looked at the good designs, looked at if there were structures in their genomes which were unique to those good designs, and we genetically engineered those structures so they occurred more often. And it turned out you could quite dramatically improve the performance of things like genetic algorithms by many, many orders. So what could you do with this? So here's some input. This is some Frank Lloyd Wright buildings. Here's an expression of the genes that are learned from these, which we then genetically engineer. And now we can generate a whole range of Frank Lloyd Wright buildings of a kind that he never generated. But you can do other things. So on the left-hand side are genetically engineered Mondrian paintings. They're fairly garish compared to what Mondrian produced. In the middle are Frank Lloyd Wright windows, genetically engineered. And what we're interested in is what happens if you let Mondrian and Frank Lloyd Wright mate. Well, I'm not talking about the people, I'm talking about the genetically engineered genes. And what you get are Flandrians. Flandrians are what happens when Mondrian's genetically engineered genes mate with Frank Lloyd Wright windows genetically engineered genes. The third column is when Frank Lloyd Wright genes are dominant, and the right column is where Mondrian's genes are dominant. These things never existed before. And then we got interested in design theory. Is there some way to talk about designs and the design processes that is unrelated to any particular discipline, or even to the task, or anything except designing itself? And with this, we developed the function, behavior, structure ontology and the processes that come along with that. And the claim is that this covers some fundamental aspect of designing, independent of the designer, the task, the environment, and actually anything. It's about designing. And it's not about engineering design. It's not about product design. It's just about designing. And then we extended that using ideas from situated cognition. Situated cognition is the idea that cognition, which is what happens in your mind, actually doesn't sit by itself, sits in a body, and the body is connected to the world. And therefore there's a world outside your head, and interactions between that world and what's inside your head play a significant role. This, by the way, is what it looks like inside, and there will be a test later on to see how much of it you got. So what can you do with these ideas? So here's an example of what happens if you build a simulation using situated cognition. What we're interested in is people running through doors. The black circles are going from left to right, the right circles from right to left. We give them some basic rules. Say you're interacting with the world, and let them run. And that's what you see here. There's no programming about where they are and so on. It's just we give the conditions for existence and action. And then we can, do the same, but at a much higher level. Now we're building computer agents, but instead of them being just little things that are running around, these are components of an artifact, and what we tell them is what they're possibly connected to. And what you see in the black area, which is going to animate shortly, is if you can see the blue, they're components. The red are constraints. And the links are the components talking to each other. Well, there's a lot of movement here. And this is how these components slowly self-assemble and inform each other whether they've met constraints or not, and who they're connected to. And you can take these ideas about situated cognition and apply them to people. So here we're looking at what's the effective design team interaction on the diversity of the ideas that the design team generates. Across the horizontal axis is how long, actually more precisely, how well design teams work, team members work together. 0 means they don't know each other and haven't worked together, and 1 means they work together very, very smoothly, and they work together a lot. The vertical axis measures the diversity of ideas generated. We use Gini coefficient, which is from economics. It's a measure of income distribution, but we're applying it to ideas. The higher the Gini coefficient, the less diverse. So what we see here is that as teams work together, team members, they get more efficient, but the ideas they produce are less diverse. And when we look in the behavior of actual teams, we see this. And we can explore all sorts of ideas using this idea of situated cognition embodied in agents. This is a system that is generating designs, and what we're interested in is which designs are novel. And we're measuring novelty based on the idea that there's a distribution of designs, and those that are far away are likely to be novel compared to the ones that are in the middle. And what we see here is that the red dots are the ones that are novel. But what's interesting is you get exactly what you would expect, which is designs that were novel. As you produce more designs, become not novel. But we discovered something, which is designs that were not novel later become novel, because the mass of designs has moved and the previous design can be recycled. And we see this a lot in fashion, less so in engineering. And then we moved on to cognition, studying the human mind. And we did a lot of work in behavioral modeling, but I want to talk more about protocol analysis, data from verbal utterances. And here's an example of the kind of result you can get. Across the horizontal axis are some aspects of designing which come out of the function, behavior, structure ontology. Vertical axis is a percent difference. And these two colored bar charts represent changes that have occurred in undergraduate mechanical engineers between when they were juniors, when they were freshmen, and 2 years later, after they'd decided to specialize either in mechanical engineering or engineering mechanics. And with this, we're able to track their cognitive behavioral differences. It's not so much the individual results here, but rather the fact this is now available to us. Here's another example of the sort of things that we can get by studying people. We have three groups of teams. The pink is industrial designer teams, the dark green are mechanical engineering teams, and in the middle are the mixed teams of industrial designers and mechanical engineers. The vertical axis measures where they put their effort. Are they putting it in the problem or the solution? A value of 1 means equal effort in that. A value greater than 1 means more effort into the problem. A value less than 1, more effort into the solution. The left-hand side is a well-defined design task, well understood, and we see these differences, they're statistically significant differences between these teams. The right-hand side is the same teams given an open design task, a task for which very little examples, if any, exist. And now we see something profoundly different. Mechanical engineers don't change their design behavior, which we might think of as design style or strategy. Industrial designers, however, shift their cognitive focus quite dramatically into the problem space. We can do really, really interesting things. So for example, we can measure through that blue line you see there, the entropy of the information flow between designers. And what is this telling us? The higher the entropy, the more open the space of designs they are producing. You don't start with an open space. As you generate ideas, so that opens up the space. As the entropy drops, it means you're taking decisions about that space and narrowing it down. So this is something that you could not get, I think, in almost any other way. And then we started to look at what are people doing beyond what's in their minds. So this is eye tracking to see whether, in this case, it's architects, do they read drawings the same way as vision theory says they should? And the answer is they don't. And the reason, of course, is that they read them semantically. So vision theory is not a good basis to build a system. And we've done work on that to show that further. Of course, we always produce works that are of a different kind. So we took the Artificial Intelligence in Design conference series and converted it to Design Computing and Cognition, which is still running. We took the work from protocol analysis and turned it into a methods book. And more recently, we've moved into this area of design neurocognition, studying the brains of designers. The first projects we started made use of a very, very low-cost device. On the top left, $799. In the middle of the top row, you can see on a standard channel layout what's being measured. The experiment I designed was, it had 2 dimensions, and then this was partially designed with Sonia Vieira. We're looking across domains. So we looked at architects, mechanical engineers, industrial designers, and graphics designers, and across tasks. Highly constrained tasks, less constrained tasks, and open tasks. Actually, the same open task you saw with the industrial designers and mechanical engineers. And we're measuring, using an EEG cap, the electrical signals that pass through the surface of the skull. And down the bottom is how just a system, the Panopto system, allows us to stream everything together. We also did verbal protocols for some of these. So we collected over 100 sessions, and here's the sort of results that you can get. This is laying the channels out on a spider graph or a radar graph. It's a mirror image from the left side and the right side, and this represents the activation levels for the tasks that we got these people to carry out. And here we're showing on the top, mechanical engineers, the first half of each task and the second half of each task. And we can see something which distinguishes design neurocognition from a lot of neurocognitive studies, the temporal aspect of design. This is totally lost if all you do is aggregate the entire session. A lot of tasks that are carried out in neuroscience, particularly by psychologists, are task repetitions, where time plays no role. You're just repeating the same task over and over again. Design is not like that. Design has at least two aspects that are different to that. It's carried out over time, and it has multiple kinds of cognitive actions that occur in different patterns. And therefore, we're very interested in time. I won't go through the details here, but we can see that architects and mechanical engineers have fundamentally different levels of activation. And we can also see that their behavior changes over time. You could try and explain these differences depending on who you're talking to. And if you're talking to mechanical engineers, you could say architects have to work much harder to get to the same point. Of course, if you're talking to architects, you could say mechanical engineers are fairly lazy. And the answer is we don't know why these are different. We don't know yet. We increasingly focus on time. So this is dividing design sessions, this is for mechanical engineers, into deciles. So the sessions are divided into tenths, and we look at the behavior in each of those deciles. And we can, the blue dots here represent where there's statistically significant differences across tasks. And we can see that how this changes over time. And then with Trip Shealy, we were looking at what happens when you get people to design using different concept generation techniques. And we looked at brainstorming, morphological analysis, and TRIZ. And here's some results from using an FNIRS cap, functional near infrared spectroscopy. The previous work was using EEG. And what we're showing here initially is simply the distribution of activations in the hemispheres, left and right. So brainstorming has left hemisphere dominance early on. Morphological analysis has left hemisphere dominance later on. These are all deciles across the horizontal axis, because remember, time plays a dominant role in design. TRIZ, it's everywhere. So let's ask some sort of mechanics questions. Where is more active in designers' brains across time? So what we're showing here are the three methods: brainstorming, morphological analysis, and TRIZ. The dots are our channels where we're measuring, and we're going across time. And the time is not in the dots, it's on outside the dots. And these are the deciles. So if you can see my mouse, it starts here in the right hemisphere, moves across to here, then to here, then to here. So we're all in the right hemisphere, and then we cross over. And we can see that we cross back and forth with brainstorming. So remember, what are we seeing? This is the most active channel. There may be all channels are active. This is the most active channel. We can see a fundamentally different behavior in morphological analysis, and TRIZ is truly, truly different. So teaching people different concept generation techniques fundamentally changes their cognitive behavior, which is reflected in these brain activation measurements. We can also look at which channel is the most connected, and this is exactly the same thing, but now we see that connections give us a different story than most activations, that is, highest activations. So what we're starting to get to is this point where we're learning more about how the brains of designers respond and connect it to their cognitive behavior, which we know quite a lot about. And the question was asked actually by an NSF program director, what can you do with all this stuff? So I came up with this idea: neurocognitive feedback. So here's the situation. Here's our participant, and we get them to do brainstorming. We're dividing the session into ventiles. We had to invent the word ventile. It comes from venti, from Starbucks. Venti is 1/20th. And we can, this is the average, let's just say the average activation. And we see that it decreases over time, and that matches cognitive studies of brainstorming, which says that you get a reduction in the production of ideas. And the average time between concepts is 65 seconds. So I said, what happens if we show people what their brain looks like when it's activated highly, and just tell them, make your brain look like that. Now, nobody knows how biofeedback works, but it's been shown to work in all sorts of things. So I thought we'd try it here. And with Trip Shealy again, this is using FNIRS, we showed people just keep that red area high. And we sampled their brain and gave them back that information. And what we found was very different to what we expected. We expected that they would last longer, produce more ideas in their brainstorming session. But what happened was they produced them faster. And the slope of the line was positive. This needs a lot more work. This is only a dozen people. And this, if you want to get more into it, we can track which parts are activated further. So it turns out when I look back, I started 54 years ago and was confronted by the professor who said that It turns out that's wrong. It's not a mystery. It turns out that if you understand design, you don't destroy it. But what we did learn with designing has an underlying structure that's independent of domain. And all those early models about iterativeness turn out not to capture design. Design is non-linear. Not only that, most importantly, it's non-monotonic. Decisions that have already been taken can be untaken, can be changed. So any notion of the way designing is presented as continuing to build is not complete. And designing is situated. It's situated not just in the mind of an embodied person, but situated in itself. As you design, you create a world within that design that affects what happens. In order to study this, we need lots of tools, but the tools don't make design anything to do with that discipline. Designing is not a science. Designing is not a humanity. It's not an art. I claim that designing is designing. It's its own thing. What's left? Well, everything is still left, but one of the major issues, I believe, is this notion of framing. One of the things we found, because we happened to record the brainwaves of people while they were reading the design task, and we discovered that mechanical engineers and industrial designers already do different things in terms of their brain activations as they read the task. So designing starts right at the beginning, not after you've read it. And that needs more attention. What I've described is being carried out with lots of people and lots of nice people who gave me money. And let me stop there.